Hello and welcome to the Conservationists Assemble, the podcast that seeks to unite with Earth's mightiest conservation heroes to raise the profile of our planet's most threatened species by putting the spotlight on the fantastic work of both in situ and ex situ conservation organisations, highlighting the link between them, as well as asking those important questions of what more can and needs to be done. Whether you're experienced in species survival or new to animal advocacy, this is the podcast for you. I am your host, Captain Conservation, a.k.a. Jonny Bloxham, and I am inviting you to join the ranks of the Conservationists Assemble community as we take the fight to Earth's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. This episode is focused on Europe's only globally endangered vulture, the Egyptian vulture, and I've teamed up with José Tavares, director of the Vulture Conservation Foundation, who has all of the intel required to inform us on what it is going to take to defeat extinction. Will you join the fight? José, thank you for joining us today on the podcast. How are you doing?
Very, very well, thank you. Thank you for having me and for your interest in vultures.
It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, there's certainly kind of a quite an overlooked species or family of birds in general, but I think they're certainly getting more popular. And we're here today specifically to talk about the Egyptian vulture and the work of the Vulture Conservation Foundation. So to prepare our listeners for this episode, could you just tell us a little bit about the Egyptian vulture, please?
Yes, so the Egyptian vulture, it's a very interesting species. It's one of four, well, I should say really five European vulture species. And I say five because in the last few years, Europe is getting a new vulture species. There is an African vulture species that is almost recolonizing naturally Europe. They are increasing, their number is increasing in Europe, certainly associated with climate change, and sooner or later we will have a native population of that fifth species, which is the Ruppel's vulture. But going back to the Egyptian vulture, it is one of Europe's vulture species. It's the smallest one. And it's also the only one that migrates. It's obviously a bird. It's a vulture, which means that it feeds mostly on carrion. It's a scavenger species. They feed on dead meat. They are not designed to catch live prey. They've evolved to explore this unique and quite important niche, which is scavenging. They are, if you like, the nature's cleanup crew. They are the equivalent of the workers that clean our cities and our streets of the garbage we produce. Garbage that otherwise would accumulate, would start rotting, would start smelling, would start being a source of disease and discomfort. And it's exactly the same in natural ecosystems. Animals die, either domestic livestock or wild ungulates or wild animals, they die, and their carcasses would start to rot away, produce methane, which is one of the main greenhouse gases. Decomposing bodies produce a lot of methane, would start smelling, would start accumulating bacteria and other germs, unless something comes about and comes around and eats and eliminates those carcasses. And that's exactly what vultures do. They detect dead animals, they eat them, and by doing so, they clean our fields, our environment, our ecosystems. Of all the carcasses, and therefore they prevent greenhouse gases, they prevent the spread of diseases, and they keep ecosystems in a much healthier state, healthier for biodiversity, but healthier for humans too. So they are extremely useful, although they usually have got a bad press because they eat dead things. They are associated with dead, their feeding behaviors very often are considered to be quite disgusting, quite ugly, because they feast on corpses of dead animals. But as I've just mentioned, without them, we would have a really worse environment and a hard time. And there's a very good example of that in India, in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, in the southern Indian continent. Vultures, unfortunately, suffered a huge decline because of a veterinary drug that was given to cattle to keep them alive, and that is toxic to vultures, a drug called diclofenac. It's the same chemical principle that we have in the Vulture that we often use ourselves, humans, and a non-steroid anti-inflammatory drug, which kills vultures. So they suffered a decline, as I was saying, 99%. So while in the past 100 years ago, there were millions and millions of vultures in the southern Indian continent, they declined by 99%. And today is very difficult to actually see a vulture in those countries. And the result of that is that the number of carcasses have proliferated because they were not eaten any longer. And with it came a huge epidemic of rabies because the number of feral dogs increased significantly because the carcasses were there and eaten, and therefore this was a good food source for feral dogs. The number of feral dogs have increased. With it came rabies because they then, of course, interact with people. They bite some humans, and there was this huge epidemic. And the Indian government, and there's good scientific evidence, spent millions and millions and millions of euros or dollars, if you want, in dealing with the aftermath of this increase in rabies. And this is just to show that having vultures means solving also a potential public health issue. Now, going back to the Egyptian vulture, it's one, as I was mentioning, one of the Europeans vulture guilds, the number of species that happen in Europe. It's the smallest one. It's the size of, I would say, a large chicken or a small turkey. It's the only one that migrates to Africa. All the other vulture species that we have in Europe are more or less sedentary. They, of course, do some movements within Europe, for example, but the Egyptian vulture is the only one that spends the summer in Europe, Eurasia, where it breeds, and then goes and spends the winter in Africa. It is the adult form is a black and white bird. It's quite a striking bird because it has got in its head some kind of plumes that give it a slightly crested appearance. Yeah, it's a small vulture that again, benefits from eating small pieces of carcasses that exist usually around dead animals. It's mostly distributed around in Europe, around the Mediterranean. The global range of the Egyptian vulture comprises Europe, Africa, and Asia. It goes all the way from Portugal to Central Asia and to India. Obviously, the birds that breed in Europe winter in Africa. The birds that, for example, breed in Central Asia, countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, they winter in India and in Iran and in Pakistan, or even in the Arabian Peninsula. There are two different subspecies. the more western one, the one that we have in Europe, and the more eastern one, the one that occurs mostly in Asia, particularly in the South Indian continent, which has got a slightly paler beak, but the two are quite similar and difficult to distinguish unless you are an expert. It's a species that is globally considered endangered. So, the IUCN, the International Union for Nature Conservation, has got this global classification of danger of extinction for most species on Earth. Certainly for all birds on Earth. There's a scale, there's criteria, and the Egyptian vulture is considered as endangered. It's in an endangered state, close to get extinct. There's one category, just one category above that is critically endangered. The Egyptian vulture is endangered. Because indeed the conservation status, the state of its populations is not very positive. The species has undergone a very steep decline in most parts in the last 30 to 50 years, has disappeared from many regions and countries. And therefore the IUCN classified it based on scientific evidence as in danger of extinction. The European population is indeed quite small, and as I mentioned, the species has disappeared from many European countries. In Europe, it was distributed mostly around the Mediterranean. In mountains, hills, some ranges, canyons around the Mediterranean, like most other vultures. But today it really only survives in three or four countries. There's really only two relatively large populations, one in Iberia, Portugal, Spain, possibly the biggest in Europe or the biggest in Europe. This comprises about 1,500 breeding pairs. And the second one is in Turkey. With this one is less studied, less well known, possibly with about 1,000 breeding pairs. Then the species has got very small populations in France, about 80 to 90 breeding pairs. In Italy, which is in the border of extinction, with only about 5 breeding pairs, and in the Balkans, the entire Balkan Peninsula, where the species currently only has about 40 to 50 breeding pairs and has undergone a steep decline, which fortunately has been arrested in the last few years because of conservation effort, and seems to have stabilized there. It lives for about, difficult to say, it lives for about 20 or 30 years in the wild. There are a few individuals in captivity that probably exceeded that lifespan. It lays 2 or 3 eggs, but it is relatively rare that more than one chick survives. Simply because there's not enough food for all of them. An Egyptian vulture nest with 2 surviving chicks, 2 chicks that fledge, is very good. And as I mentioned, is relatively rare. It breeds in spring. It arrives from Africa, usually in the month of March, April. Then it comes to the European or Eurasian breeding grounds. occupies, it's a cliff nesting, a rock nesting bird. So it breeds on rocks. It does not breed on trees. It usually occupies a crevice or a hole in a cliff, in a large cliff, and inaccessible. Lays its eggs, usually arranges a small nest with some wool, but relatively basic nest with some wool, lays the eggs, then incubates them for about a month. Both male and female incubate, and then the little chicks hatch, and they feed them for another 2 months or so before they eventually fledge. As mentioned, it is unique in the European Vulture Guild because it is migratory. In August, September, they migrate through to Africa, where they spend the winter. And like most soaring birds, birds of prey, storks, they cannot fly over the Mediterranean. They need birds of prey, storks, and so on. They are relatively poor flyers. They cannot sustain a flight for many kilometers, and they need to use the thermals, the hot air currents that emanate particularly from mountains, and that's also why they are usually associated with mountains. Is because in mountains you've got these hot air currents forming because of the differences of slope and all that. So it's fairly easy for a soaring bird, a bird of prey, an eagle or a vulture, to actually explore large areas with the help of these thermals, these air currents that form over mountains. These air currents, they do not form over the sea, which means that over the sea they would need to fly actively, flap their wings and fly continuously. And as mentioned, they are limited on that. And therefore, the migration routes that they take is, like many other birds of prey and storks, twofold. The western populations, Portugal, France, Spain, they all come to Gibraltar, and they cross to Africa through the Straits of Gibraltar to Morocco, and then southwards to the area south of the Sahel, south of the desert, which is the main area where they winter. The ones from the east, so the Balkan Peninsula, Turkey, and so on, they need to fly through the Middle East, around Syria and Lebanon, and then through the Arabian Peninsula to reach Africa and their wintering grounds. A few individuals do try to cross the Mediterranean, particularly young, inexperienced birds, but unfortunately many of them die during this attempt. We have tagged, we have put quite a number of GPS tags, small devices that we can put on them. For example, when they are in the nest, when we go up the nest and so on, that can give us their position. And we have unfortunately followed a few of these individuals, young individuals, that have tried to cross the Mediterranean and that have drowned. And some of them actually almost within sight of a coastline. And we have measured and researched those movements, and we came to the conclusion that usually their limit is about 400 kilometers, 500 kilometers. So they can go out to sea and possibly fly during 300, 400 kilometers, depending a little bit on the conditions of the wind, if it's a headwind or a tailwind, and so on. But after 400 kilometers, they get exhausted, they die, they fall on the sea, and then eventually drown. And we've had a few individuals that have attempted to do that, and that within sight or very close to the North African coast, they have drowned. Individuals that, for example, attempted to cross from Crete in Greece to Libya, or from Italy to Libya again, and or from Cyprus to Israel, and that have drowned after 200, 300 kilometers of active flight. They are indeed special birds. They do have got a role, and they've played their part in mythology. Um, the Egyptians, and they do appear depicted in quite a number of Egyptian temples. The old Egyptians used to call them the pharaoh's chicken. They are white, therefore, they might resemble a white chicken. In the Balkans and elsewhere. Um, they are also associated with spring. As mentioned, they come from Africa in March and April. So they are like the swallows, for example. They are associated with the appearance of spring. They are sometimes called the white spring angels, because they appear in the sky in spring. They bring good news. They bring news that the weather is getting better. And this, of course, in old folk, old mythology, local tradition. Unfortunately, they are quite rare these days. And if you want to see an Egyptian vulture, you really need to go to Spain or to a couple of places in Turkey in order to see them with certainty. And in Europe, as mentioned, they are present between March and August, September. Then they leave to Africa. I just wanted to add that we have started to see a new phenomenon, and this is really interesting, and we are monitoring, which is the appearance of a wintering population in Europe. This started about 20 years or so ago in Spain, where we started to see here and there, particularly in western and southern Spain, some individuals, some Egyptian vultures overwintering. And this is certainly associated with climate change, with the fact that winters are milder everywhere, but particularly so in southern and western Iberia. There's hardly any frost, and there's no snow. The temperatures are relatively mild, and so this overwintering has been increasing. And currently, there is actually a site in Extremadura in western Spain, which already concentrates over 100 individuals every winter, and a site that we are monitoring, and the numbers have been increasing year after year. There's also sightings have been increasing in other places in Southern Europe, for example, in Crete. The number of Crete, a Greek island, the number of overwintering individuals has also been slowly increasing. This is surely a sign of climate change. We are trying to research what does it mean for survival and for the conservation of the species. But yeah, a fascinating species. And one that is quite rare and endangered at global level.
Yeah, thank you for giving us such a great insight into what the Egyptian vulture is all about. And it certainly, it highlights, like you from the back, like you said, kind of what they can do for us, and what having them around means in terms of their benefit. But also, actually, that while they've got this kind of stigma of being quite a nuisance or a pest, that actually in some aspects, historically and presently, that they are quite celebrated. So in terms of finishing up on why they're quite rare, could you just outline some of the threats to us?
Yes, indeed. I mean, they were never really considered a pest in the sense that they never killed anything that is valuable to humans and so on. They were just considered ugly and
Mm.
unimportant. They were either ignored or loathed simply because they were associated with death. But yeah, very important threats. So why did they become quite rare? I think for several reasons. I think for three main reasons. Up until about 100 years ago, people would shoot everything. So direct persecution certainly played a part. And in the past, it was quite common to shoot raptors, birds of prey, out of the sky, and they resemble a bird of prey. So they would also be shot at. That is now quite rare. It still happens. We still are losing some vultures in some parts of Europe because I would not call them hunters, because true hunters would not really shoot a protected species out of the sky. But poachers or people that do that, it's obviously illegal. That still happens, albeit at a much reduced rate. But this was indeed one contributing factor. The second, possibly the biggest threat in the past and still the biggest threat in the present, is poisoning. Now, so they would die simply because they would eat poisoned meat, poisoned baits. Now, this poison is not directed at them. Nobody really poisons vultures. This is directed at carnivores and or birds of prey, sometimes eagles, that compete with humans. And this is mostly a human-wildlife conflict associated with livestock breeding. You have predators, wolves or bears or lynx, killing cattle. And therefore, livestock breeders don't like that situation. They want to remove the predator, and they put some poison in the field. Now, this poison is indiscriminate and will kill anything that will touch or eat that bait. And this might include humans. And we've had a few cases in Europe of humans getting killed because they've touched poisoned meat. But it certainly killed many carnivores and birds of prey. Or is also associated with hunting. That's when, for example, eagles eat game species that the hunters it's obviously important for the hunters, and they do the same thing. This practice was once legal, was even encouraged, but is now illegal in most parts of the world for the last 50 years. But it is still, unfortunately, practiced simply because sometimes these people that live a real human-wildlife conflict do not have any other solution to solve it, and therefore they resort to this illegal and indiscriminate practice. And this is still this has decimated populations. In the past, vultures would kill in their tens of dozens around a poisoned carcass, around the poisoned bait, and is still happening in some parts of Europe. Then the third big cause of its decline is really the question of availability of food. In the past, we had extensive pastoral agriculture systems where there were a lot of herds out there. That obviously had some amount of mortality, and dead sheep, dead cows, dead pig were left to nature for scavengers to eat. That's not the case. On one hand, quite a lot of these extensive pastoral systems have disappeared, and they are now indoors in intensive livestock breeding facilities. And on the other hand, the ones that existed also had some restrictions in terms of what they could do with the fallen livestock, because of strict veterinary regulations that were introduced, notably in Europe, about 20 or 30 years ago. Some of them associated with the mad cow disease that was transmissible to humans, that caused some deaths. And therefore, the veterinary authorities have adopted regulation that made it compulsory to destroy every single carcass of a dead animal that was, that existed in the field. They would need to be taken by trucks to an incinerator and then burnt there, which meant that the amount of food available for vultures is now a lot less than what it was 100 years ago, or so. I mean, shooting was a really important cause, not any longer, but caused its decline. Poison, very, very important, is still there. Amount of food still has decreased a lot in historical times. Recently, we have been able to change a little bit those veterinary regulations, and in some countries we can have what it's called supplementary feeding sites, or more popularly known as vulture restaurants, where one can leave carcasses in a fenced area for vultures and other scavengers to come and feed. And in some countries, like in Spain or in France, it is actually possible to leave some carcasses of some dead animals. I'm talking about goats and sheep, for example, out there for the vultures to eat in some areas of the country where vulture populations are healthy. And then I just would like to mention a fourth threat, which also has been increasing historically, which has to do with electrocution and collision. And this has been increasing historically because the electricity network has been increasing, the number of lines, the number of infrastructure has been increasing. So electrocution in particular is quite a problem. Electrocution occurs when a bird lands on a medium tension electricity pole and then touches the wire while it is sitting on the pole, and that of course makes it a connection of currents and the bird is electrocuted. This is a big problem, particularly in some types of pylons where the lines are too close with the pylon itself. It's easily solved, and we are working with electricity utilities to solve it. You just need to insulate a part of the cable next to the pylon so that when they touch it, there's no current because it's insulated with some isolating material, plastic or tape or some other device. But it is a problem, and many birds do get killed. And I'm talking about vultures, but I'm also talking about storks and birds of prey. Tens of thousands of birds of prey do get killed in Europe every year due to electrocution. So in the core areas of the species population, we try to work with electricity companies so that they mitigate this threat by acting on these poles. So yeah, this is really the main mortality factors for the species, which also explain the steep decline that they had in the last 100 years or so.
Yeah, electrocution certainly, I suppose, it's certainly not, when you think about threats to species, that's a very kind of modern problem. Certainly not one that I'd heard of before. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of have that brought to attention, and good to know that it's an easy fix, and things that are being done to try and mitigate it.
Yeah, and it's a threat that will certainly increase in the near future. You know that apart from the biodiversity crisis, we have another crisis, the climatic crisis, the climate change crisis. There's really an emphasis on renewable sources, which is very good, of course, wind farms, solar farms, and so on. The problem with that is that will increase a lot the amount of energy infrastructure, because you've got a wind farm. Wind farms themselves can actually be dangerous to birds of prey, because if placed in the wrong area, on top of a ridge, migrating path, they can kill. And in some areas, they've actually contributed to the decline of vultures. But apart from the wind farms themselves, you actually then have got all the associated infrastructure, because that energy needs to be transported to substations and all that. So all the cables, all the pylons, and so on. Ideally, all that should be buried, and that would have no impact on biodiversity. But that is very expensive. But yeah, we are working with electricity companies to try to solve this issue, which is a real issue in this day and age.
Yeah, I think that, and that leads nicely into our next topic of conversation. So, how did the Vulture Conservation Foundation originate?
Yes, I mean the Vulture Conservation Foundation actually originated with one project and one idea, which was actually associated with another vulture species that we have in Europe, which is the bearded vulture, formerly called Lammergeier, which is a vulture species of high mountains. And the Vulture Conservation Foundation originated because a group of individuals, visionaries, about 40 years ago, got together to try to bring that species back to the Alps, where the species had been extirpated in the recent past. The only way to do it was through captive breeding and reintroduction. So for the first few years, they established an organization called the Foundation for the Conservation of the Bearded Vulture, because it was mostly concentrated on bearded vultures. They got some bearded vultures in captivity. They started to breed them, and then they started to release them in the Alps. And that project became one of the most successful wildlife comeback stories of our times. The species is now back to the Alps. There's now over 80 pairs, and so on. After this project, the organization evolved a little bit and decided to actually work on the conservation of all vulture species and not only of the bearded vulture, even though bearded vulture still keeps being one of our flagship species. And therefore it changed its name and became the Vulture Conservation Foundation, and started to actually work on projects across Europe with the conservation of the all vulture species. We are still very strong on captive breeding for reintroduction or translocation for reintroduction. So what we've been doing is we've been releasing bearded vultures across Europe in many, many places, in Spain, in France, in Italy, in Austria. Next year, we'll start a reintroduction project of bearded vultures in Bulgaria. But we've also been very active in translocating birds from, for example, Spain, other species of vultures, cinereous vultures and griffon vultures from Spain to other places to reintroduce or restock smaller populations. In that case, we don't breed them. We take not individuals from nature, because we don't catch individuals in nature, but we take individuals from wildlife rehabilitation centers and release them elsewhere with, of course, the agreement of the Spanish authorities. And this has proved quite successful in restoring vulture populations elsewhere, in reintroducing vulture populations elsewhere. We can do this because, fortunately, vulture populations in Spain have increased significantly in the last few years due to a lot of conservation effort. And therefore, there's actually quite a number of individuals that, for one reason or the other, are found weakened, that go to wildlife rehabilitation centers, and that can be then transported back. This is something that I would like to say. Vulture conservation in Europe is a success story. And vultures are doing today in Europe much better than they were doing 50 years ago or 100 years ago. It's a fantastic success story. The populations of the Egyptian vulture is actually the exception. It's the only one that is still declining, or at least is not increasing. All the other vulture species, the griffon vulture, the cinereous vulture, the bearded vulture, are increasing significantly in many populations, are reoccupying their former range. And this is really a very good conservation story. It's the result of a lot of investment by NGOs like the Vulture Conservation Foundation, by national governments, a lot of good research, being spent on these species. This contrasts, however, with the very dire situation of the vultures elsewhere. In Africa and in Asia, vultures are declining very fast. In Africa, for example, they have about 13 vulture species, and 11 of them are endangered or critically endangered. Most species elsewhere, other than in Europe, are not doing well at all, and this is because those threat factors that I've mentioned, direct persecution, poisoning, lack of food, electrocution, are still very much active and killing, particularly the poisoning aspect, killing dozens and dozens and dozens of vultures across Africa, across Asia. As I mentioned, there was a 99% decline of vultures in Asia. This was also because of this diclofenac drug that appeared there in Sardinia. In Africa today, there are countries, and you usually think of vultures as something that lives in Africa. There are many countries in Africa that you cross and you don't see a vulture. One single vulture, because they've been really extirpated. They have disappeared, and everybody looks at Europe as the reservoir, as the best practice of vultures, of vulture conservation, which is something that many people get surprised at, because many people don't even know that there are vultures in Europe, and they certainly don't know that probably the best place to see vultures these days is actually Spain. You go to Spain, to some places in Spain, and you can see 500 vultures, circling around you, landing on a carcass and feeding on a carcass of 2 or 3 species of vultures, which is now quite rare to see elsewhere in Africa. So yeah, the Vulture Conservation Foundation is working on all vulture species now, mitigating these threats that I've mentioned. We work a lot with governments on mitigating poison, making sure that these crimes, illegal poisoning, are investigated, they are persecuted, they are punished, improving the capacity of enforcement agencies to detect these crimes, which is not necessarily easy, to investigate them, awareness campaigns explaining to people that poisoning is not a solution. There are other solutions to try to solve the driver of poisoning, which is this human-wildlife conflict. Working with utility companies, as I mentioned, to mitigate the electrocution problem, working on the issue of food availability by establishing supplementary feeding sites, by changing the regulations so that carcasses can exist in the countryside, and so on. So we are working across Europe. We've got projects. We've got now currently about 10 large-scale projects from Portugal and Spain to France to the Alps to the Balkans, in all these aspects, fighting poisoning, increasing food availability, researching, and so on the 4 vulture species. And the results are mostly quite good and quite positive. And we are seeing this increase of vultures in Europe.
And with that increase, is there any potential for those vulture species to have conflict or over kind of resources, or do they kind of live quite harmoniously?
Yes, that's a good question. First of all, for example, when we do a reintroduction project, we only do them in places where we know that there is viability for the populations. So before doing a reintroduction project, we actually do a feasibility plan, and we study, for example, things like food availability, and we only reintroduce vultures in a place where there's actually enough food for them. and where the threats that affect them are mitigated, because it's reintroduction, particularly captive breeding, but also translocation of individuals from rehabilitation centers is something that it is quite expensive. And it's technically it's not very easy. You need to transport vultures from one side to the other, release them. They need to survive, and it's not worth doing it if you release a bird and the bird has got an instant death, because there's a lot of poisoning, or so we only do it in places where we are quite certain that it will work out, and there's a lot of preparatory work needs to be put into that place. But your question is also good, because recently there's been, particularly in places where vulture populations have increased significantly, and I'm talking here in countries like Portugal, Spain, and France, allegations that vultures are changing their food habits and they are starting to kill cattle. And there is a lot of rumors and news in the social media and the internet about that. Oh, vultures became predators, they are attacking young sheep, and so on. We've also investigated that it is an issue that worries us, because of course that could mean that then vultures could start getting directly targeted if they cause a human-wildlife conflict. What happens is there are a few cases where actually vultures might be involved in in what we call ante-mortem consumption. This is meaning vultures getting involved in starting to be interested, or trying to eat an animal before it is actually formally dead. But this is exceptional cases of weakened or death-bound animals that are immobile for one reason or the other, seriously wounded, that would die in any case. And obviously, a vulture would when there is immobility or near death, a vulture would respond to that. If the animal is healthy and if it jumps, if it turns around, the vulture will not be able to do anything. But there are those cases. There are, though, a lot more allegations of such incidents than actually the real cases, and which are spreading, spreading like fire through the social media. If you want, most of them are actually fake news. They actually are only alleged cases of mortality, not real cases of mortality. And we are also working on that, by working with the press, by working with the people, by trying to show and demonstrate the real story. Quite a lot of these cases is simply because of lack of knowledge, lack of experience, due precisely to this increase of vulture populations. Vultures are now repopulating areas where they were absent for 100 years, which means that there is no historical knowledge of their ecology in the area. And people pass in a field and they see three sheep alive, and then they pass in the same field again 3 hours later, and they see one of the sheep is dead, and they see three vultures starting to feed on the sheep, and naturally people might say, oh, the vultures killed the sheep and they are feeding on the sheep, and then that spreads like wildfire. Well, no, the sheep probably most likely died because of another reason. Dogs, for example, are a big cause of mortality of livestock. And then, of course, the vultures come, but people don't know that vultures are scavengers, and they associate. As I mentioned, there are some cases, and that is also associated with changing practices in the countryside. There are some cases where, for example, during births, Some difficult births. A sheep is giving birth to a newborn, and it's a difficult birth. And both mother and infant are struggling for their lives because there's a problem in the during the lambing season. There's a problem in the birth. It may be that in those cases the vultures come and start pecking on the newborn, which is in danger of dying in any case. This also might happen more and more because before there were shepherds, and these lambs would be tended and would be cared for, and therefore whenever this happened, it would happen indoors because the shepherds would try to help. These days, animals are left out in the countryside on their own. This happens, completely out in the open, and might actually increase the chances that the number of problematic birds might out there in the open might increase, which might increase the chances of these encounters. But yes, we are working a lot on this, trying to demystify the issue, tell the truth, and counter some allegations and some fake news that like everything else in the world, unfortunately, are quite common out there. I mean, it's very simple. We've had cases of people coming to us and saying, even, look, vultures almost attacked me. And one can understand. Look, you walk in the Pyrenees, you are in your hike in the Pyrenees, and you stumble upon a carcass of a dead animal with 50 vultures perched on a carcass. You stumble upon that scene, and what happens is the vultures will be as scared as you might be, and they try to lift off. They try to go away. The problem is that they are heavy birds. They are very heavy birds, very, very, very heavy birds. They cannot simply lift off and disappear. As I mentioned, they need thermal currents to lift off, and very often they need to circle at very low altitudes. They need to circle in order to try to get a current to lift off, to move away from what they see as danger, the human. Now the human sees these birds lifting off right on top of them and starting to circle. And we had this description, starting to circle. And they say, oh, they are interested in me. They want to kill me. They want to. No, I mean, the birds are trying to really fly away, but they just they need to circle in order to get a thermal that will then take them away. But they are then on top of you, and people say, "Oh, they're trying to kill me. They are trying to kill me." We are trying to explain or trying to interpret these behaviors to people so that we try to them to see things as they are and not as they are perceived. But that's an issue for us as well.
Yeah, certainly trying to raise public awareness is a very crucial part of conservation. So going forward, would you say that, or kind of, are we trying to replicate some of the successes that we're seeing with the European species of vulture in, say, Africa and Asia now? And how are the Vulture Conservation Foundation involved in that? Are you communicating with kind of African counterparts or anything like that?
Indeed, a lot. The threats are the same. There are, of course, some variations here and there, but the threats are basically the same. And there's a lot that can be learned. And indeed, we have a lot of requests and we have a lot of exchanges. Quite a lot of our conferences and technical meetings, we invite people from these parts that come here, we go there. The fight against poisoning, for example, is the same everywhere. Reintroduction, I mentioned the reintroduction of the birded vulture. Now in Southern Africa, we are actually trying to set up a captive breeding for reintroduction program, very similar to the one that actually exists for Europe in order to save the birded vultures of South Africa, which are also declining very, very fast. So indeed, there is a lot of exchange. We organize vulture conferences every 4 years where these experts come. The last one was last year in Spain. We had about 400 people coming, mostly from Europe, but quite a lot from Africa and Asia as well. Next one will be in 3 years' time. So there's a lot of those exchanges because the tools, the methods are often the same. And indeed, we need to help our African and Asian colleagues, also because and we have the Egyptian vulture that spends part of the year cycle there. And even if we do things well in Europe, this doesn't mean that the results will be good, because part of the cycle of this species is spent elsewhere, either during migration or during the winter. So we need to think and act globally in conservation if we are to be successful.
Absolutely. So it's great to hear that these organisations are mutually supporting each other. What support, or what kind of forms of support do you receive from other organisations to help your organisation in your work?
Yes, I mean, obviously, this is very important for us as well. And thank you for mentioning it. Conservation costs money. And it's not it's effective, but does cost money. We have been receiving support mostly from the European Union. The European Union has got a fund, a budget line called LIFE, the LIFE program, that actually funds nature conservation activities within the European Union. And those projects that I've mentioned are mostly funded by the EU LIFE program. And this has really been allowing us to actually do hardcore conservation actions across Europe. It also allows for some work outside Europe, even though it's a little bit more difficult. So we are a little bit more limited in that. Other than the European Union, and this is also one of the reasons why biodiversity in general and vultures in particular is doing quite well in Europe, because there's this investment. There is legislation, and there is this investment by the European Union and by national governments in nature conservation. And in fact, Europe is the only continent that's where biodiversity globally, particularly rare species, is recovering. And there's in fact some sort of a comeback, a rewilding of Europe. The number of wolves, the number of bears, the number of eagles, the number of vultures is today far bigger than it was in the recent past. And that's because there's a number of factors, but one of them is because there is funding, and governments and European societies identify biodiversity conservation as a priority. There are, of course, many other priorities, social, health, and so on, but biodiversity is there. Apart from the European Union Life Fund, there are a number of other foundations that do fund us, particularly projects, for example, in Africa and so on, but these are limited. We, of course, also receive donations from the public. You can check our website for those. But it is important. It is important that these funds exist, because otherwise we would not be able to do the work. As I mentioned, captive breeding for introduction, translocation for introduction, does cost money, significant money. Transporting vultures, building acclimatization aviaries, release them into the wild, monitoring them, buying the GPS devices that we put on vultures to monitor how they are doing, if they die, if they don't die. All of that costs money, and it is necessary to have that small investment. But I mean, very effective. I can tell you that the EU Life Fund represents less than 1% of the European Union global budget. And with less than 1%, the results in terms of biodiversity conservation in Europe have been phenomenal, and that's why you have now vultures in Europe. You've got wolves, you've got lynx, Iberian lynx, bear, and so on, with less than 1% of Europe's tax money. So an incredibly efficient use of public resources, far more efficient than many other sectors, unfortunately, where there's a lot of waste and a lot of ineffective spending and ineffective policies.
It's really great to hear, and imagine if kind of it was more than 1%, the outcomes that would be achieved. I do just want to focus on captive breeding for a bit. So, say obviously we've utilised captive breeding for some of the other species that are found in Europe, but bringing it back to the Egyptian vulture, because there is quite a good population in zoos, for example, and I believe that the breeding program is managed out of Prague Zoo in the Czech Republic, if I'm correct. Would there be scope, if those threats to Egyptian vultures were mitigated, for the Vulture Conservation Foundation to work with zoos, or are they already working with EASA zoos, for example, in some form, to potentially reintroduce Egyptian vultures to the wild should it become feasible?
Yes, another great question indeed, and that's precisely our strategy. We would like to do the same that we are doing with the birded vultures, with the Egyptian vultures, and we are already working with it. We are already building a captive flock. We already have got, directly managed by the VCF, we already have got about 10 birds. We know that there are about 100 or 200 birds out there distributed among zoos. We are collaborating with EASA. We are collaborating with those zoos in order to start a coordinated effort towards captive breeding for reintroduction, because as you well said, with this species probably we need that in order to do reintroduction and restocking, because the species is rather rare. I talked about maximum 1,500 individuals in 1,500 breeding pairs in Western Europe. The number of Egyptian vultures that enter wildlife rehabilitation centers, even in countries where the population is relatively large, like Spain, is very small, and is not enough to sustain a reintroduction project. So if you want to do a reintroduction or restocking with the species, it needs to be from captive breeding, like with the birded vulture, and therefore that's our next step. I mean, we currently coordinate the birded vulture captive breeding scheme, and we would very much like to replicate that with the Egyptian vulture. The complication is that they require slightly different things to breed in captivity than birded vultures. It's not copy and paste in terms of aviary design, in terms of conditions. They are a migratory species, and so on, with a slightly different biology and ecology. They require, so even the protocols that were developed for the birded vulture do not necessarily apply for the Egyptian vultures. We are now looking into the protocols, developing protocols, because in the zoos where they exist, the breeding productivity has been rather low. And therefore we need to improve that breeding productivity in captivity in order to have enough birds to release in the wild. It's a long process. It's not something that can be fixed in 1 or 2 or 3 years, but it's something that we are already looking into.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's great to hear that those connections are in place. There's certainly kind of a everyone pitching in mindset. So it's great to hear, and I'm sure great things are going to come of it. So Jose, thank you for giving us a insight into the background of the Vulture Conservation Foundation. We just want to get an insight into your background now and learn about your journey to where you are today. So yeah, could you please just tell us how you came to be a part of the Vulture Conservation
Yes,
Foundation?
but I mean, I'm a biologist, so I did biology in the university. I became interested in, I mean, I was a bird watcher before becoming a biologist, and I was always interested in birds and bird conservation. After biology, I started a career on bird conservation, and I worked for the Portuguese National Park Service. I also worked for the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, for a number of years. This is in general bird conservation projects. And then about 10 years ago, I applied to become the director of the VCF. The VCF was then very small. And I was selected to become the director. In the last 10 years, I've been trying to develop it, and it has expanded across Europe. Is now really covering all the threats, working on all the threats affecting vultures. So yeah, it comes from a lifelong passion for birds, but also from training in the sense that I've trained to become a conservation biologist, and an ornithologist. Unfortunately, I spend most of my time now in front of Excel spreadsheets and dealing with the numbers and problems and people and managing projects and people rather than out there in the field. Once was a happy field biologist, so, watching birds and collecting data. I'm now spending a lot of hours a day in front of the computer, but occasionally I still have got some opportunity to visit some of our projects and see the fantastic work that colleagues, and I mean, we work with lots of other partners across Europe. In every country we work with a number of national conservation organizations, some specialized on vultures, some more general bird conservation organizations, that know the situation much better than we do, that can understand and engage with all the different stakeholders in all the different European languages. But yeah, it's been a great trip, and there's still a long road uh, ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure. And you mentioned that love of birds. So was there a particular, obviously you mentioned that you kind of applied for the role of director at VCF 10 years ago. Was there always a particular passion for vultures or
To be honest, no. But there was one thing that always, I mean, there was a challenge there, which was actually the challenge of working with something that is not well liked. I tend to like, and I tend to like the underdogs.
yeah.
Nobody likes the house sparrow. I love house sparrows. Everybody thinks, oh, it's boring. It's like a little brown job. Nobody tends to like gulls. They are noisy. They are dirty. They cause a lot of trouble in towns. I actually like gulls. I think they are, if you really look into their biology and their behavior, they are really fantastic birds. So when I saw the job, and I actually talked with family members and with friends and said, well, what about vultures? Everybody said, ugly birds. And I said, oh, there's a challenge. There's a challenge. So I actually like that challenge, the challenge of picking up, working with a group of birds that is not well liked, but that is extremely important, and that was in need of help, and revert a little bit the situation, so that in a few years' time, people would say, "Oh, vultures, very interesting, fantastic," and that's really my challenge: is reverting a little bit the mindset, and I hope that you and the listeners will say the same thing after this program.
I'm absolutely sure they will. Yeah, great to see what motivates you. So then what was your first experience with an Egyptian vulture?
Well, actually, as part of the RSPB, when I was working for the RSPB, because the species was already endangered and we focused on endangered birds in Europe, we were already trying to help and support. And I have worked with Egyptian vultures before my time at the Vulture Conservation Foundation. My first actually hands-on experience with Egyptian vulture was in Turkey. I was helping the RSPB support or international program, and there was this this site in Turkey, west of the capital Ankara, in Beypazarı, where there was a very dense population of Egyptian vultures, but nobody really knew how many there were, how important it was, and what were the issues there. So we have developed a project together with the Turkish Conservation Organization, and we've helped actually train and fund some Turkish biologists to look into that. And my first hands-on experience with Egyptian vulture was exactly that. Was in central Turkey. I spent then some weeks in the field, training and trying to research and understand what was happening. They were very dependent on a rubbish dump, trying to depend how dependent they were, trying to understand how dependent they were on the rubbish dump, trying to and you know we concluded that the population was indeed quite big. There were about 100 pairs in a relatively small area that were suffering from some of these threats that we've talked about. Were dependent on the rubbish dump. We did quite a lot of awareness programs. Unfortunately, that program is still continuing, and there's still somebody looking into Egyptian vultures in this particular area, which is actually one of the most important nucleus of Egyptian vulture in Europe. So that was really my first contact with vultures and with Egyptian vultures in Turkey, sometimes in a smelly rubbish dump, with 30 degrees or 35 degrees heat.
And what first surprised you when you started your career in conservation?
I think, I mean, what I rapidly learned is that conservation is complex, is multifactorial, and involves lots and lots of different factors. You cannot do conservation without hunters. You cannot do conservation without farmers. You cannot do conservation without politicians, with decision makers, because they all will do something or will decide something that will impact. So you need that. That was really, I mean, a conservation biologist trains and learns, field techniques and statistics and data analysis, and how to characterize behaviors and how to identify, but they are not really trained to go to a mayor's office and discuss with the mayor's office or discuss with the farmer the needs of a species. And this was, I think, the first shock and one of the big learnings of my career in conservation, is that you'll need a lot of diplomacy skills and a lot of stakeholder engagement tools in order to be successful. You need to understand what the problem is, what the drivers are, and the drivers are often human related. In fact, I often say that in conservation, birds is the easiest part. What is really difficult is humans. Is managing the different human-related aspects of the conservation project, because birds are predictable. They arrive, they breed. If the conditions are there, they breed, they feed, and then they leave or not. It's what kills them, what destroys their habitat, and that is very complex, because of course it has to do with human society, human social factors, and that's really difficult. So and that aspect I had to learn. I didn't learn that in the university or in books. You have to learn it day by day by practice.
Yeah, it sounds that all kind of leads nicely into my next question then. It's interesting to hear what you had to learn on the job. So, what advice would you give to someone looking to pursue a career in conservation?
Well, what I would say is practical experience is key. I mean, obviously, knowledge is important. So invest in yourself, invest in knowledge. Get familiar with the tendencies and of conservation biology. You can get that from the journals and from the scientific conferences. What is really the latest tendencies and what is going to be the future. So that is important in invest in knowledge, do a masters on that aspect. But then, as I mentioned, that will only prepare you so much for the job. There's a completely other aspect, which is this stakeholder engagement, dealing with humans, understanding the multifactorial causes of the conservation problem you are trying to solve that you can only get through hands-on experience. So if you can if you don't have the opportunity to actually work professionally on projects, try to volunteer on some projects, because by volunteering and having this hands-on experience, you will understand, you'll see it firsthand, you will understand, you'll get a little bit of experience. This is really the two things that when we are recruiting that I look into. On one hand, knowledge, and information. So a person that has studied, that has done some formal or informal education on the matter that we are recruiting for, a person that knows the trade, but crucially, also someone that has had some hands-on experience, that have worked in some way or the other, volunteer or not, in projects and not only someone that comes from the university, that has done all the masters and PhDs and all that, but has then no practical experience. Is a little bit the mixture of two, and I would say that this hands-on experience is very often the deciding factor. So get out there, participate, contribute to projects, and learn from them. Particularly these human negotiating skills, diplomacy, learn how to see the other perspective. Because of course, you want the conservation of the bird, but the farmer will have another perspective, a legitimate perspective. The hunter will have another perspective, the legitimate perspective, and understanding their points of view is absolutely crucial for the success of a conservation project. And somebody that understands this is really important.
No, it's a great advice there. So, what are some of your proudest achievements to date?
Well, I mean, they are not my individual achievements, but the achievements of the VCF and the achievements of the team, because you are dependent on lots of people. It's really it's what matters out there. It's the fact that birded vultures. There are 80 pairs of birded vultures in the Alps right now. In the beginning of the 1980s, so 50 years ago, there was zero. There's now 80 pairs and the population is growing. Is the fact that there are cinereous vultures in Bulgaria, breeding in Bulgaria now. There were none. Is the fact that we've prevented the extinction of the griffon vulture in Cyprus through restocking the population. The fact that there are birded vultures flying in Andalusia when they were extinct in the mid 80s. It's really it's these concrete results. Vulture populations in Europe are increasing. In some places, they are double or treble their numbers. A lot more people are talking about vultures. This is not my individual achievement. It's the achievement of lots of people, to which, of course, I have contributed a smaller or greater part in different formats. But yeah, I think is the fact that the species are coming back, the species are being restored, in an effective way is the best achievement and the best legacy that I can, I can identify.
Yeah, it's absolutely work that is worth shouting about. So yeah, good for you, and good for all of the team that have been involved in those projects. So Jose, I think you've really had a great career, and it certainly sounds like there's a lot left to achieve. So we're just going to finish the episode on some quick fire questions, just to learn a little bit more about what makes you tick. So are there any dream species that you'd love to work with or to see in the wild?
Well, I mean, I would I would like to see many species, but again, as I mentioned, it's still the commonest ones next to you that often because that's also the ones that you see more often. That always say, "Wow, fantastic bird! Look at that house sparrow in my garden, doing this," or the light shining on that. On that great it. I would love to see the Andean condor. I've never seen. It's a vulture species. It's a New World species from the Andes. I've never seen also the Californian condor, so I would like to see those two condor species. And who knows, maybe one day we will also start helping and working with the vultures in the New World, condors and so on.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure they're certainly very awe-inspiring. Uh, I don't think there could be much to prepare you for seeing that. Um, how about places that you would love to visit then? Is there anywhere that you would like to visit?
Yes, I think the Central Asian mountains and the Himalayas. I visited very recently. I was in a conference in Uzbekistan, and we had only one day, and we went to the lowest of the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, and there were vultures everywhere. And I just said,
Fantastic.
well, I would love to continue for a few weeks and go into Tajikistan and into the Pakistan, the Pamirs, the Himalayas, and see all those mountains and see the vultures in those mountains. That's something that caught recently my eye. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that sounds really cool. Well, as we all know, it's a very full-time job working in conservation. So after a day fighting extinction, how do you relax?
Well, I do like sport. To break because it is quite difficult to actually switch off. And very often you are thinking about vultures in the evening and during the night and all that. And I find that one way to switch off is actually to do something, either to go for a run or to go for a bicycle ride. So I tend to relax by doing some sport. And that also helps me keep me fit, which is important because unfortunately there are some long marathons, and I mean work marathons that we need to
Yeah.
do, and I think you need to be in a good state of health in order to endure some of the challenges, some urgencies, and I think the sport gives me that balance. And that's why that's how I relax. I mean, I obviously also like to pick up a book sometimes after sport, and then you are physically exhausted, and you pick up a book and you read. But yeah, I would say that sport is my way of relaxation.
Wonderful. And how can our listeners follow the work of the Vulture Conservation Foundation?
Yes, I mean we are present in all the means, the social media, and of course the website. You can go to our website www.4 that's the number 4 vultures.org, or you can look Vulture Conservation Foundation on Facebook, on Instagram, LinkedIn, and so on. We do publish 2 or 3 or 4 very interesting stories about our work every week. There is some volunteering opportunities. For example, in October, very soon, we are going to have what we call the International Birded Vulture Observation Day. So if you live in an area with birded vultures, Spain, France, the Alps, and so on, you can actually volunteer to go and count them in the mountains, something that is coordinated by a huge range of regional coordinators. We sometimes have got some webinars which you can follow. So I would suggest that you check our website and you follow our social media pages. You'll have plenty of nice photos of vultures. And I hope that you'll find there some interesting content to pursue this interest.
Yeah, I'll be sure to provide links to the website and social media in the episode description. So lastly, Jose, do you have any final messages for our listeners?
Well, I think it's important that people do something in everything, act. If you think something is important, act. If you think that act, politics is important, vote in your elections, participate in local politics, and in this case, do act. And acting in this case can be. Can mean lots of different things. Spread the link of this program to your group of friends. Organize an event in which you actually tell a group of friends or your family about vultures. Go and visit your nearest vulture center or birds of prey center with vultures to learn a little bit more. Donate. Anything. I think it's important. And my request is, if this has interested you and if you think it's a worthwhile cause, do something, even if it is only sending an email to a group of friends telling how great the story was and that you think that vultures merit a little bit more attention. Do act in this like in everything else in life.
A great point to finish up on there. So Jose, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on the podcast and discussing not only Egyptian vultures, but the plight of the vultures and the successes of your work. We really appreciate your time. We look forward to seeing what more is going to be achieved and how hopefully the future of other vulture species is going to improve as well.
Great. I thank you very much for your invitation and for your interest. Great to be here.
Hey there friends, sadly that does bring this episode to an end. I have loved having you on this journey with me. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the Egyptian vulture. And look, if you're constantly wondering if conservation works, if you don't know exactly how you can get involved and make a difference for the betterment of the planet and the species featured on the podcast each week, and you feel like it's guesswork, you feel like while you so desperately want to help save wildlife and better understand the work of zoos and other conservation organisations, you don't know where to begin. If you want to find out exactly the answers to all these feelings, then why not make this podcast your conservation headquarters by following, rating and sharing the podcast with your friends and family. Tune in each week and interact with the podcast to receive up-to-date, honest information on all things conservation, but also to take part in other ways like sharing your favourite pictures, videos or stories of animals, or perhaps your experiences at a zoo or in nature firsthand. But your interaction with the podcast can go further than that. If there are any particular conservation topics or species you want more clarity on, this is the platform to see that happen. Or maybe you have something you wish to talk about and want to be featured in an episode, then why not get in contact by emailing Conservationists Assemble at outlook.com. Thank you so much for listening. You've been amazing as always. Until next time, this is Captain Conservation signing off. Over and out.